Well, I get the opportunity to visit with you about 3 different projects, and the first one is a real situation that we had here in Kansas in the 2018 corn crop. We had some pretty high fumonisin levels all across our state, but in particular, our west central or central area of the state, you get around Beloit area, had some really high fumonisin levels in some of the corn. If you look at the information in the literature on fumonisin, it said that we should be able to feed up to 20 parts per million with no real clinical signs, and then lower feed intake as you go higher than that, and then some real severe problems if we push up above that 50 to 100 parts per million area. And so we conducted 3 different experiments. First off, I want to thank Hubbard Feeds for helping us test a lot of different sources to find the high level of fumonisin corn that we were able to bring in. Oak Creek Farms, fortunate for us, maybe for the trial, not fortunate for them. They had some corn that worked into this really high level for us to be able to purchase in and do the trials with. So we did 3 different experiments, and Johnson had ran all these experiments and did a great job of putting together first off of a titration. We went from our low fumonisin, shows you just what we were dealing with last year. Is our clean corn had a diet that was 7 parts per million of fumonisin. So the clean corn was about 10 parts per million, and then once you blend it in the diet, we left us with 7 parts per million in the complete diet. The other end of the spectrum, we formulated a diet that had 35 parts per million of fumonisin from the contaminated corn. So that corn was running about 50 parts per million of fumonisin, at least in this trial it was. Okay? And so we made those 2 diets and then blended them to get the intermediate levels. And you can see that I have these levels at the top. That's a combination of B1 and B2. We also measured fumonisin B3, which is not thought to be quite as toxic, and those levels also increase linearly as we increase the level of the high fumonisin corn. All of these levels are from the North Dakota State University's lab, and fortunately for us, this corn was very clean for other mycotoxins, and so it allowed us to just test the fumonisin level. And as we increased the level of fumonisin, it matched up with what the literature told us almost identically. As we went up to 20 parts per million, there was really no big negative effect, but as we went over that 20 parts per million, we started seeing this reduction in average daily gain. Most of that reduction in gain was due to feed intake, but we also did see some impaired feed efficiency, especially as we got up in that 35 parts per million level. But when you look at this performance, and you go back and look at the average daily gain, it's really, it's a hit, but it's not as big a hit as what we were maybe expecting to see. And so when we came back for the next experiment, before I go on to that, the other thing we measured these is this sphingosine, sphingomine, I don't know if you pronounce the dang things. Yeah, SASO ratio. There's only one lab in the country that measures this that I'm aware of. University of Missouri has one of their diagnosticians measures this ratio. What this is telling us, it's like, think about it, there's the elasticity of the blood vessels in the lungs and whether they can get, if you get pulmonary edema, is what happens if you have this high SASO ratio. You end up with the blood vessels become fairly rigid basically, and it can't move end up fluid gets built up in the lungs, and you end up with heart failure can occur with it when you get to these really high levels of fumonisin. And so this is a measure of that, and it tells us that even at these lower levels that we never saw impacts on performance, we were seeing this increase in this SASO ratio on day 14 of the study. We saw the same thing on day 28 of this initial study. Okay. So once we did that first trial, we set us up for what we really wanted to test is, are there some mitigants that we can use to try to reduce the negative effect of these high fumonisin levels? And so we tested 3 different products and at the recommended inclusion rates from the companies, did 2 different experiments. And part of the reason we did 2 experiments was we took that same corn, we were aiming at that 35 parts per million, and so we used the corn for this next experiment, and we came back in the first trial, and all of those diets came back at 60 parts per million. Shows you how variable the fumonisin was in the corn, even that we were using in the study. 60 parts per million didn't work quite as well. It has pretty negative impacts on the pigs. And you can see here is that we ran this trial for only 14 days, because of the negative impact. And the first weekend that we put the pigs on test, we did have 3 of the pigs, I think 3 or 4 pigs at Johnson that we lost fairly quickly on the trial. But then the death loss stopped, and we went out the 14 days, though, almost a 50% reduction in average daily gain due to the Fumonisin. And as you can see from the data pretty clearly, the BioFix Select product actually did quite well, bringing performance back to the same level as the control, with no differences between the negative control and the other products. And you look at feed intake, that's where most of that response was driven by. Big feed intake differences, and again, the BioFix Select was able to bring feed intake back, even with that very high Fumonisin level. And feed efficiency shows the same kind of response. And so just how negative that high level of Fumonisin was on feed efficiency. But because of that high level, we thought, well, it's maybe not a fair test. And so we did come back and test it again at the lower inclusion, lower Fumonisin. We blended down to have 30 parts per million of Fumonisin in this study. And so at the 30 parts per million of Fumonisin, we see a similar negative effect as we saw in our first experiment on average daily gain. But again, the BioFix Select was able to bring the performance back to the same level as that positive control. So really nice response to that product, and again, feed intake driven response. And you see the response coming through in feed efficiency, with the feed efficiency being very similar, slightly higher with the BioFix Select than the positive control. One of the things I didn't show all the SASO ratio on all these products. When you get to the really high levels, the 60 part per million level, even with the BioFix Select, where the performance looked pretty good, the SASO ratio was still high on that treatment. And so even though we got performance back, we weren't able to take away all the negative effects of the Fumonisin. Fortunately, it looks like the Fumonisin is not as big a problem for us this year, particularly in Kansas. I talked to the North Dakota State, Michelle Mostrom up there runs the diagnostic lab, visiting with her back and forth the last few days here on this, several emails about what's going on around the country. She said so far the samples they've got have looked much better than the past, but she's gotten some really, really nasty corn coming out of South Dakota in particular that is as ugly a corn as she's ever seen. And it's not because of Fumonisin, because it's got several mycotoxins all packaged together in one corn that are all over the limits that what you'd want to see. And so big thing, like Bob said, is we want to be testing more of the corn, especially as we've had a lot of these wet conditions around harvest around the U.S. to see where things are at. But with Fumonisin, we feel that this opportunity was very nice for us to be able to both validate the previous research on showing what the negative effects are on the pig, but then also testing the products and finding that BioFix Select did do a really nice job of getting performance back to the same level of the control. And the other feed additives that we tested, at least with the Fumonisin levels that we use in these diets, did not provide us with a benefit. The second project that I'm going to summarize up for you is some compensatory gain data. And Mariana, before she finished up with her PhD, did a literature review for us to try to understand some of the phase feeding trials that she'd been doing at New Horizon Farms, and really did a nice job of looking at what happens when we feed different diets to these pigs. In particular, we're talking about lysine levels in most of these studies. If we restrict or feed a deficient lysine level in the early phase of these pigs, or if we think about phase feeding, if we do a 2-phase trial versus a 4-phase or a 6-phase, what happens? And in that restricted period, why does sometimes when we restrict them, these pigs compensate in performance and come all the way back to control, and other times they only get part the way back and they don't compensate all the way? And so what Mariana did was she took all the different trials that had been done looking at that had measured performance during a lysine titration that had a subsequent phase to look at what happens later in that pig's life. And she was able to categorize them and put them really nicely into this scatter chart here, where you have 4 different categories. On the left-hand side here, we have the final body weight. And so if they're above the line, the final body weight of those that were restricted was actually higher than the control. Okay? Below the line, the final body weight is lower than what the control is. And then you look at the average daily gain during the recovery period across the bottom. And so here, if they're on the left-hand side of the vertical line, that means they grew slower in the recovery period than those that were that were not restricted, the controls. And then if they were on the right-hand side, they did show compensation, and they grew faster than the controls. And so everybody on this side of the line grew faster than the controls did, and those on this side of the line grew slower than the controls. And then she looked at those different trials and said, okay, what is it about these different trials that some of them grow faster and some of them don't? And just summarize it up to you on one slide, try to pull it all together for you, is the important factors that she found shouldn't be too surprising, but the degree of lysine restriction is a big one. If you restrict them too much, they can't compensate, which makes sense, right? So if you restrict them too much, it's a problem. If your duration of restriction and recovery is wrong, it's a problem. So if you restrict this period for too long and you don't give them long enough before they have to go to market to recover, they can't recover. Okay? But if you give them a long enough time to recover, they have enough time to make up for that lower lysine level. They can make up for it in growth in the finishing period. And those should have pointed out that that was really the difference between those that had complete recovery and those that had incomplete recovery. It was mostly driven by this lysine restriction and the duration of time. Then why some of these pigs did not have any compensation was all due to the lysine level in the recovery period. So if you don't give them a high enough lysine level, they don't have enough lysine to drive the protein deposition during that recovery period to show that compensation. Okay? And so it gives us the information that we need to try to at least design some of these studies to lower our numbers of phases, because really that's what our overall goal is with all this research, is trying to look at can we go from doing this multiple phases, that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 phases that people sometimes try to do during the growing pig's lifetime, and then shorten that down and use this compensation to do a 2 or 3 phase program. We've adopted this now in some production systems, and it's very interesting. We've gotten down to, I think we're pretty comfortable that in the grow finish stage, you probably can do 2 phases, our research is showing, and be able to get the same performance as a multiple phase program, as long as that last diet is not below their requirements, and in particular. And the Australians, they have a much shorter lower live weight that they finish on, and they finish bores instead of barrows, and so there's some differences there, but they're really pushing for a single finishing diet. That's really and they've got several trials that they've done now showing that they can do one diet from basically 50 pounds to about 240 pounds in their market. I don't think we're going to get down to one diet, but I do think that there's opportunities to at least drop it down to 2 or 3 diets pretty successfully. The third area that I'm going to talk about is give you an update on some of the stuff I talked about last year with some Enrique's data, looking at branched chain amino acid ratios. And this gets pretty deep for the non-nutritionists in the crowd, but what it really is, importance of it is for the amount of corn protein that we're putting in diets today. And so we have corn is our base ingredient. We have distillers grains, obviously, and now we have high-protein distillers grains that Bob talked about. And we have corn germ, corn gluten meal, a lot of different ingredients that bring corn protein levels up in the diet. And Enrique did a nice job of putting together a summary for us of this equation that I talked about last year on his meta-analysis. So what we did in this last year is went back and tried to test this, whether this equation was accurate. And so this one, Hayden Kirkhart ran this study, a new fashion pork, and Hayden had about 1,260 pigs in this experiment. And what we really did was we set out to have a diet with low levels of lysine HCl, high levels, or a moderate level, where we just increased the ratios a little bit over the negative control. And I'll show you these a little bit in the next slide. And then we added either valine, isoleucine, or tryptophan to this third diet to be able to test again whether we could improve performance. And so I only put this slide in here to show you that all these diets had 30% DDGs except for the very last phase, and for the nutritionist to see those lysine HCl levels that we basically went from 3 pounds per ton to 10 pounds per ton, or 8.8 pounds per ton. And so then we're formulating down to whether we're formulating to valine or have to add some valine to those diets, or adding, when we get down out here, adding either valine, isoleucine, or more tryptophan for the diets on top of that positive control. Okay? And just to look at the ratios just briefly, look at the crude protein levels and how those change in these diets. Lysine levels all stay the same. This is just showing the phase 3 diets. The leucine levels is our concern, is that when we have the high DDGs in these, we drive up this leucine level. And that leucine level is what we believe increases the requirement for valine, possibly tryptophan, and isoleucine. And so at negative control, we're at 53 isoleucine, 68 valine, 17% on tryptophan. Those are very close to what we would have been recommending and formulating for a long time in corn soy type diets. And then when you go to the positive control, we increase those ratios to 58, 70, and 19, and then increasing either, again, just valine, isoleucine, or tryptophan above that. And then the predicted average daily gain we have shown here, and we'll come back to that in the very last slide. So when we look at the overall average daily gain, this is one that the pigs don't often read the textbook or read the protocol, but they did quite well in this experiment. And they performed almost exactly what we were hoping they would. The negative control, we see that drop off in performance, and bringing it back some with the positive control, and almost all the way back with either valine and isoleucine. The only treatment that wasn't able to bring them back that we predicted from the modeling that it should have was the tryptophan treatment. And we look at the final body weight, what this really means. I mean, you look at from that soybean meal to the negative control as a 13-pound hit, and that's what we've been seeing in some of these trials when we put high levels of synthetics in, and we weren't understanding why we were getting that big a hit. And so I think this research is helping us understand that if we bring those ratios up in our positive control, we only lost 4 pounds, but we still lost 4 pounds. And we bring it back with the valine and isoleucine, we get very close again to our final body weight, with again the tryptophan not giving us any benefit over that positive control. Feed efficiency, the model said that, again, that feed efficiency wouldn't be impacted very much, but it would be a little poorer for these diets than what it would be the soybean meal diet, and that's what numerically it showed on the responses here, but really not a big change in feed efficiency. And then finally is to compare what the predictions were versus what the actual, and we adjusted the axis on the predicted to the soybean meal, and so then looking at the relative differences is really what you want to look at here. But so you look at the prediction equation almost perfectly predicted what the performance of most of these treatments, except again for the tryptophan treatment. And so this, I think, has given us some really good base data. We're going to go back and test this with different types of diets with even more corn protein, to see if we it will match up with those quite as nicely as it did in this particular experiment. With that, before I turn things over to Chad, there's one person that's here that's first time for him at Swine Day that we've showed data from New Horizon Farms to you guys for, I don't know how many, like 25 years now at Swine Day, and a lot of experiments. And Marty Hines, Marty, can you stand up? There you are, Marty. Marty, I want to thank you for all you've done. Marty has mentored many of the grad students over the years. He's helped us with immensely number of research projects. He's the one, when we talk about we get getting these diets all put together right, he's the one that gets it put together right, the one that gets all the ingredients there, and allows us to actually do the stuff that we're doing and helping all the grad students out. Really appreciate all your help over the years, Marty.